All right, well, let's begin gluing stuff together. And the glue begins with routes because remember, nothing happens without a request arriving at your app and somebody figuring out which controller and which method or which action in that controller is going to handle it. So we're back to thinking about RESTful resources. And remember that besides the sort of basic operations of CRUD plus indexing, which is basically give me a list, in the web world, there's sort of two additional, what I'm going to call pseudo actions on resources. And remember I said, when we talk about HTML forms and interacting with HTML forms, really you should be thinking of it as these are operations that you can do on a resource. Well, as it turns out, in order for the user to, let's say, fill in a form to create a new instance of something, the form itself has to be served first. So that first operation, which in Rails is called new, doesn't actually create anything, but it returns an empty form that the user can fill in. And then once the form is submitted, that would be an action like posting or putting, depending on whether you're creating or updating an existing one. Similarly, if you want to modify an existing resource, usually it's convenient for the user to first see a copy of what it looks like now and then maybe make some changes on the form to update certain aspects of it. The serving of the form has to have some way to happen in the HTML, HTTP world. And so Rails defines two additional routes by default that go beyond what I'll call the pure resource actions, right? And you can imagine that in a world where the requests to your app are not coming from a human being at a web browser, but instead are coming from another app, like they're coming through your API, you don't need the new and edit operations in an API, because in an API, you've already retrieved the copy of the resource, you made some updates to your copy, and now you're going to post it back. So the pseudo actions for new and edit are really there for the benefit of human beings using the app. The other thing to notice is that some of these routes, like the read, update, and delete routes, and the sort of new and edit pseudo routes, I guess, have an ID parameter that's part of the path. Why don't create or index have an ID parameter? It doesn't make sense to say why would create have an ID, because you're creating a new thing and it's not going to have an ID until after it gets created. Similarly, why does an index have an ID parameter? Basically saying, give me just and it might not be all the ones, it might just be some large subset of them, but it's not referring to any specific one. And so that's why only the routes that refer to doing operations on a specific and existing resource will have an ID parameter in them. Now, again, these are not the only way. You can define routes that look any way you want, but because these are common operations in a world in which your app is really a collection of resources, these are sort of the default resourceful or RESTful routes that Rails uses. And as we said, an app uses the new and edit pseudo actions when there's a human being involved, and you have to serve a form before the form can be submitted. But if your app was being accessed via something like an API, you probably wouldn't need it. The other question, and I think now you have the context to answer it, is for the new and edit pseudo actions, why is it okay that we're using the HTTP verb get as opposed to using something like put or post? Because after all, if we're going to create a new thing or edit an existing thing, aren't those operations that will result in having side effects and changing model state? He asked naively. And then someone said, why no? Get is fine because one possibility is that, the rule that side effectful actions should you use post or put, that's only a rule because we say it is. I mean, that in principle, the app can decide that get is okay for doing stateful things. But let's assume that the app wants to be good and it doesn't make that decision, and that indeed get should only be used when no state changes are occurring. Why is this still okay? Asking for a blank form that you could use to create something, that doesn't actually change anything, right? It's like somebody handing you a piece of paper that's blank. Until you actually write something on it, no state changes have occurred. Same thing with edit. If you say, give me a copy of the current version of this so that I can make changes to it. Well, yeah, when you make those changes, the update action does in fact use post or put, but the act of getting the current version or the act of getting a blank form does not actually change state, so it's fine to use get for those. What does the routes file look like? And again, this is one of the cases where I will show you 5% of the answer. The other 95%, some of it's in the book, a lot of it is in the Rails guides, which are super, super useful. But what does a routes file look like that would actually define these routes for a real Rails application? It looks something like this. And the general way that you read these lines is the first part is an HTTP verb. The second part is a URI path, which may or may not include sort of wildcard parameters that begin with a colon, so they look sort of like a symbol. Then there's this symbol, which in Ruby, among Ruby programmers, they call it the hash rocket, like the little right-pointing arrow. And finally, a string that names the controller, followed by a pound sign, followed by the action, the method name within that controller that receives the route. So, for example, if I see an HTTP route that matches get using the HTTP verb get, and the route matches /movies, and then something that can be mapped to this ID parameter, then I will call the movies controller, and I will find the show action. And by the way, even though it's create, read, update, delete, why is it create, show, update, destroy? Well, sorry, because it just is. It's the same reason that, you define a constructor in Rails with initialize, but you call it with new. It just is. Sorry, you just got to remember. So the default controller actions corresponding to create, read, update, delete are named usually create, show, update, and destroy. The default action that corresponds to index is happily called index. And then the controller usually will also include the new and edit actions that, as we just said, return either a blank copy of a form for creating a new instance of that model, or return a copy of a form that is already pre-filled with the current values so that the user now has the chance to update them. And you might imagine, by the way, the other thing that you get from defining routes in this way is you get a bunch of methods, right? Ruby methods that get defined for you essentially on the fly that you can use in your views. For example, I will get a method called movie_path, and you could sort of see the pattern here. It's the name of the resource followed by _path. And I can pass a parameter to it, and what I will get back is the URI that corresponds to how that route would have been mapped. Now, remember that a full route consists of both an HTTP method and the URI string. So for example, the movies path without any arguments, it'll just give me back the string movies, but depending on whether I put a post verb or whether I put a get verb, those could correspond to two different actions. So the combination of an HTTP method and this path helper will give you back the corresponding URI. So basically, the routes that I'm setting up here really are going both ways. They're saying, if I see this HTTP method and a string matching this, it tells me which controller action would correspond to that route. But I can also go the other way and say, I would like to generate the route corresponding to a particular action. Well, now I get these little helper functions that do it for me. And why would you want to do this? Because if I change the mapping between the way that a route is parsed and which controller and action it corresponds to, I do not now have to propagate that change all through the rest of my app. I don't have to go to all the places where those routes are generated and change them. So it's an example of dryness because all of the information needed to go in both directions is kept in this one place. Just like we only use an ID token when there is an action that refers to a specific resource, these path helpers, the way they're defined, the path helper method name is singular if it applies to a specific resource, but it's plural otherwise. So it's new movie path because, new movie path is actually a terrible example. Could you mark that? I got to fix that, Michael. Edit movie path would have been a better example there. Movie path, which is designed to give me back, a reference to a particular movie, expects an argument. And so movie is going to be singular, but movies path, because it refers to the collection, is going to be plural, right? So, and again, all of this is basically Rails creating these methods for you at runtime based on the values that you give in the routes file. Oh, and by the way, how do you know if movies path refers to the create action or the index action? It's because the route has to have an HTTP verb associated with it. So the URI part of the route is actually shared in common across a couple of different routes, right? So like read, update, and delete look very similar, but the verb is different in each case. That's how you tell the routes apart. So having defined some routes in your file, you can always go to the root directory or the base directory of your app, and you can say Rails routes. That will basically list all of the routes that are recognized. And in fact, I'm going to show that in our little toy app in just a moment here. But before I do that, because this pattern of routes is so common that given that you have a resource that you've set up, like a movie, and you probably want to define all or most of the basic CRUD routes plus the index route on that resource, That is such a common idiom in some sense that there is a shortcut for it. So in the same way that when we looked at really simple Rails classes and we said, well, defining getters and setters that all they do is modify an instance variable, that's such a common operation that Ruby has this sort of a shortcut, attr_accessor, that sort of saves you from having to manually write out all that code. There's a similar mechanism here where I can replace all of that collection of routes with the single line resources movies, and that basically expands to everything you just saw. It says, in effect, movies are a RESTful resource in my app, and I would like all of the standard RESTful resource routes with all of the standard parameter binding for things like a primary key and all of these path helpers that I can use in my views. So the single line resources movies gets you all that. And in a sort of very cleanly constructed app that really is based around resources, the routes file is going to probably be very short because a lot of the routes are set up with shortcuts like this. Take note that before Rails 5, instead of saying Rails routes to see what routes your app had, you would have to say rake routes. Again, just be aware if you try one and it doesn't work, check which version of Rails you're using. And we'll do a live coding demo next to look at the routes in our little toy app.